This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. We have another installment of Hollywood Hates History today. Today we have the first of not one, but four-part conversation on the incredible 1993 classic, Gettysburg. We are joined by two Civil War fanatics and podcasters, Sean McIver of the Come and Take It Texas History podcast, and Professor James Early, a frequent contributor to Beyond the Big Screen, the History of the Papacy podcast, along with Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast. In this first episode, we will look at the broad overview of the battle and film. We will also discuss the major source of the movie, the 1974 historical fiction novel, The Killer Angels by Michael Shara, and the prelude to the battle. We have much to talk about, so let's get right to it. If you have a historical movie you love or hate, let me know, and maybe we can make an episode for Hollywood Hates History. I have a few other movies in the works with Scott Rank and others. If you'd like to participate in Hollywood Hates History, send me an email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next time beyond the big screen. Welcome back. Today we are talking about the great movie from 1993, Gettysburg. Today I'm going to be the host, but we have two great guests, but we're all kind of in on this together. I'm Steve Guerra, and I host the History of the Papacy podcast as well as Beyond the Big Screen podcast. I'm joined by James Early and Sean McIver. Sean McIver is of the Come and Take It Texas History podcast, and James Early is a professor from San Jacinto College who is an oft-times collaborator with Scott Rank on his History Unplugged podcast. It took a little doing, but we all came together. Are you excited to talk about Gettysburg?
I am totally excited. I've been wanting to do this for a long time. I'm so glad we're finally doing it.
Why don't we just we'll jump straight into it. James, can you tell us a little bit about the background on the book and the movie Gettysburg?
Yes, the movie Gettysburg is based on a novel called The Killer Angels, which was written in 1974, published in 1974 by Michael Shara, or Shara. I'm not really sure how that's pronounced. I think it's Shara.
Shara. It's Shara.
Shara, okay. Shaara. Michael Shara is kind of an interesting person. He was a writer in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s a little bit. He wrote primarily science fiction and sports fiction, not too much historical fiction. He had four novels, of which The Killer Angels is his second, and it's his only novel that is historical fiction. As a side note, it's interesting that he also wrote the book For Love of the Game, which was turned into a movie with Kevin Costner. But anyway, I don't want to get too far off track. But The Killer Angels was very well received. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1975. And Shara, after he wrote his fourth novel, For Love of the Game, Killer Angels was the second one. After that, he just wrote, well, actually not much of anything, if anything. And then he died in 1998. Interestingly enough, after that, his son, Jeff Shara, took up the torch and wrote a prequel called Gods and Generals and a sequel called The Last Full Measure, making a Civil War trilogy. And then Jeff Shara went on to write many, many, many more historical novels. But going back to The Killer Angels, what's interesting about The Killer Angels is it tells the story of the Battle of Gettysburg through the eyes and the thoughts of some of the major commanders on both sides. For example, there are chapters devoted to Robert E. Lee, what he is seeing, what he's thinking. There are chapters devoted to James Longstreet. On the Union side, the primary character is Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who is the commander of the 20th Maine Regiment, one of the key regiments on day 2 of the battle. And there are other characters, of course, that are brought into it as well. But he really does a great job in the book of putting you inside the mind of these commanders and what they were thinking and what they were feeling, what they were hoping to do, hoping to accomplish. It's fiction, of course. It's not a regular history book. It's a historical novel. But I think Shara does, or Shara. It's going to take me several times to get used to that. But he really, I think it's a very accurate novel. A lot of the speeches and the dialogues are just made up, but others are based on things that these men wrote in their diaries or their letters or their memoirs. So it's a fantastic novel. I'm not going to lie. I'm just going to go ahead and lay my cards up ahead of time. I love this book. I love this book so much. I've read it probably 5 or 6 times, and I love this movie. This is one of my all-time favorite movies of any genre. But anyway, so that's The Killer Angels. The Killer Angels, it took them a while to make it into a movie, but the movie was made by Ted Turner. And Ted Turner, it was going to be a miniseries, but they just decided to make it into a movie. And the movie itself is extremely long. In fact, I read that it's the longest feature film ever to be made and shown in movie theaters.
Huh.
Clocks in at about 4 hours and 15 minutes. There's an extended version that's even longer. Just in case 4 hours and 15 minutes is not long enough for you. But I remember when it came out, I was in grad school the first time, and I went and saw it in the theater. I think I was all by myself. My wife says, there's no way I'm going to watch a 4-hour war movie. So I went and saw it in the theater twice. So that's just how nerdy and how crazy I am. But I've always been a Civil War nut. So the movie stars, it has an all-star cast. It's an amazing cast. The primary character on the Confederate side is actually James Longstreet, and he is played by Tom Berenger, who's been in Platoon and many, many other movies. Robert E. Lee is another of the major characters. He's played by Martin Sheen. Everybody knows who Martin Sheen is. He's been in films for several decades, and he was on The West Wing for many years, the TV show. On the Union side, the primary character is Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who's played by Jeff Daniels, also a veteran actor who's been in a million things. And let's see, who am I leaving out among the major characters?
Sam Elliott.
Yeah.
Sam Elliott. How could I leave out Sam Elliott? Doggone it. Sam Elliott. If you don't know who Sam Elliott is, just turn off this podcast right now and go do some research. Or go watch like 10 of his movies. Sam Elliott is a legend. He's been in many Westerns as well as other movies.
He was in The Big Lebowski. He played the cowboy.
Yeah,
he was the narrator. Yes,
he was in. We Were Soldiers, the Vietnam movie with Mel Gibson. He was in. Gosh, he's been in so many things. He was in the original Hulk movie, the one that it had Edward Norton, I think, or I don't know.
He was in the original one with directed by Ang Lee.
Okay, so yeah, he was the general. But anyway, so great cast. There's a lot of other people. C. Thomas Howell is in it. Who else?
Richard Jordan plays Louis Armistead, and this was his last role. You can tell he was dying of cancer, and you could definitely tell he was not well. But he's such a. If you've seen, Richard Jordan. If you've watched The Hunt for Red October, he's the national security advisor.
No way, really? Oh, yeah. I'll have to go back and watch that again.
Yeah,
folks, Sean is like Mr. Movie. He is a walking film encyclopedia. Sean
Lazenby was in it too.
Yeah,
wow.
There's a James Bond in there. You have to look.
Yes, and he's a Southern general.
Go ahead.
Great.
Sean. Stephen Lang is he plays George Pickett, and when they made the sequel, Gods and Generals, in 2003, Stephen Lang was brought back, but he actually plays Stonewall Jackson, and obviously Stonewall Jackson was dead at the time of this battle, so. He had played George Pickett, and he was really good. And they had him play Stonewall Jackson. So there's quite a few famous actors in this movie. Quite a few.
Thomas Howell.
Yeah. There's a lot of character actors too. John Deal, who is a great character actor, who was in Nixon and Stripes and The Shield. You've got Cooper Huckabee, who plays Harrison. Cooper Huckabee was in Urban Cowboy. Tim Scott, one of my favorite cowboy actors, who was in Lonesome Dove, he plays He plays Dick Yule. Baldy Ewell, and then a bunch of. I mean, you got to watch it. You'll see a bunch of weird cameo people. Different early roles from people and small actors. Donald Logue is a really good actor. Kevin Conway plays Buster. Maxwell Caulfield. Yeah, there's a lot of notable character actors in this movie. So the movie was actually supposed to be a miniseries on ABC. It was pitched on ABC. ABC then backed out because they'd made a miniseries starring Gary Cole about George Custer that had done really poorly in '91, and so they dropped the show. Ted Turner got involved. Okay, we're going to air it on TNT, and he saw it during post, and he loved it, and he thought that it should be a miniseries. It shouldn't be a miniseries; it should be in theaters. And he just bought a New Line Cinema, so they released it in a small run of theaters, only 250 theaters. It did pretty good, and then it did monster ratings when it aired on TNT in 1994. So, and he actually has a cameo in the film. He plays a Confederate soldier in
Turner Ashby, right?
No, he plays William Patton, or Waller Patton. Sorry, Waller Patton.
Yeah,
I'm looking at Wikipedia. Thanks to Wikipedia, we have these things at hand. And then Ken Burns, the famed documentarian who had just done the Civil War and made the Civil War. I want to say that the PBS documentary, The Civil War, turned a lot of people on to the Civil War and made this film in a lot of ways possible. So he plays an aide to General Hancock during Pickett's charge also. And most of the cast, though, it has a cast of thousands. Most of them are authentic Civil War reenactors. And so when you watch this movie, you can tell that it was made as a miniseries because it's made for TV. It's not particularly bloody. There's nobody there's some scenes in the hospital where the people are getting their legs cut off, but it's not shown in detail. There's no one getting their heads blown off with cannonballs or anything like that.
Like in Glory.
Yeah, like in Glory. Glory's pretty graphic, right? Which that's my favorite Civil War film. But the other thing is that they had thousands of Civil War reenactors who were not getting paid for their work. They were volunteering their time to be part of these massive battle scenes, and these are guys who put a lot of money and time into their gear, and so they probably weren't wanting to get them exploded and burned and covered in fake blood. So that's the only negative to the film. But when you read about the actual actions of filming this movie, I think you get an appreciation for the fact that they got so many Civil War reenactors in one place and moved them around and had them being participating in the battle. The other thing that's fascinating is that this is one of the very, very few movies you will ever see where the battle takes place in the actual battlefield, in the places where history actually occurred.
Yes.
They were granted permission to film the battle scenes on the battlefield, and they had to cover up some statues and some obscure them and some markers and things like that. But when Pickett's charge is occurring, that's Pickett's charge. That's the place. That's Cemetery Ridge, right? That's the place where the high water mark of the Confederacy is. So I think, and I think that's one thing that's fascinating about Gettysburg. I've never actually been. I went to Vicksburg this year, and I was a little disappointed that there was only certain parts that really looked like what probably looked like during the siege and the battle. From what I understand about Gettysburg, it looks like it did. It's been preserved, other than the statues and the cemeteries. So.
Yeah, didn't in Vicksburg the course of the river changed or something?
Yeah, that occurred, but they've allowed the forest to grow up. Basically, there's a lot of trees where once there was siege lines. So it's understandable. Flanders in Belgium doesn't particularly look like it did in 1914, but 1915. So I understand why. But Gettysburg, I understand, has been very, very well preserved as a is a place where the battle occurred.
Yeah,
So
I was there in 1991. Of course, that's been a long, long time, but it was very. I mean, I obviously wasn't there in 1863, so I can't say it looks just like it, but it looks. It's very pristine. Other than all the monuments and stuff, you really feel like you're there, or you could be there in 1863. Like if you just went back in time, all of a sudden, it wouldn't look much different at all, other than the monuments.
Right, and unlike Vicksburg, where they had 6 to 8 months of siege, or even somewhere like Northern Virginia, where they had the armies were tramping around constantly fighting in there. The battle sort of occurs in rural Pennsylvania, out in the middle of nowhere. So, you can imagine the beauty of this bucolic farmland scene, and all of a sudden this battle just pops up. So, the ravages of war did not occur in Pennsylvania. Under normal circumstances, they occurred outside of Richmond. They occurred even 20 miles west of Washington D.C., but they did not occur in Pennsylvania. And so that's what I think you really get a captured feeling of that when you have these scenes in this movie.
I'll just add, I was at Gettysburg maybe 2 years ago, right around the time of the battle, early July. We'll get into this. You cannot believe how hot it was there. It was about the same temperature, like over 100 degrees. So hot that the pavement was kind of mushy underneath your feet. So that's just to give you a little idea. And James will give you can you give us a little idea of how these two armies were basically organized?
Yes,
to help us with the background.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step over you there. I think it is important to give a little bit of discussion, because we're going to be throwing around terms like regiment and division and corps. So in the time of the Civil War, the basic military unit was the company, and the company had a paper strength of about 100 men. Now, when I say paper strength, that is what it is, quote unquote, supposed to have. And at the beginning of the war, at the very beginning, most companies would have about 100 men, and they were commanded by a captain. But over the course of the war, obviously, people would be killed or they would die of disease, and so the size of a company would dwindle. And generally speaking, the Army's policy was not to bring in more people. Like if you think about Vietnam, if your company lost 10 guys, you would get 10 new guys, right? But during the Civil War, you didn't. So by the middle of the Civil War, 1863, the average company would have maybe 40 or 50 men. And by the end of the war, some companies were down to 10, 5, or 0 in some cases. There were companies that were completely eliminated. Now, the movie doesn't ever, in the book, they don't talk about companies. They talk about the next level up, which is a regiment. If you put together 10 companies, you get a regiment. So a regiment, which is commanded by a colonel, like Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. A regiment's paper strength or initial strength was about 1,000. But again, they were going to be much smaller by the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. We'll see that the regiment that Chamberlain commands, the 20th Maine, only has 250 right before the battle starts. They actually will get some reinforcements, and we'll talk about that later. But so you had regiment commanded by a colonel, and then if you put together 3 to 4 regiments, that would be a brigade, and a brigade was commanded by a brigadier general. So a brigade would have 3,000 to 4,000 men paper strength, and again, much less in reality. If you take 3 to 4 brigades, put them together, you get what's called a division, and we will talk about some divisions commanded by certain characters in the book. A division, therefore, would have between 9,000 to 16,000 men paper strength. So just basically the rule of thumb is cut that in half, average it and cut it in half. So the average division is going to have around 6,000 or so, maybe, or less. And then finally, if you put together 3 or 4 divisions, you get a corps. A corps would, CORPS, like the Marine Corps, you would have 18,000 to 64,000 paper strength, and then but in reality, probably 15 to 20,000. And then you put a bunch of corps together and you get an army. Okay. The two major armies here are the Northern Army is the Army of the Potomac, it's called. And it is commanded by General George Gordon Meade. General Meade was just given the command a few days before the battle started. The Army of the Potomac, under the command of Meade, had about 110,000 people roughly. About 96,000 would be engaged, and it was divided into 8 corps, a bunch of different corps, and we'll talk about some of those commanders later. The most famous one was the First Corps, commanded by Major General John Reynolds, and we'll see what happens to him. But anyway, they had several corps. It's the corps are smaller in this army than they're going to be in the Southern Army. They average about 10,000 each. On the southern side, you had the Army of Northern Virginia, of course, obviously commanded by General Robert E. Lee. They had about 70,000 men. So we're talking the North, or the Union Army, had 110,000 to 70,000 Confederates. The structure of the Army of Northern Virginia was more simple, more compact. There were only 3 corps. First Corps, commanded by General James Longstreet. We will talk a lot about him. The Second Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Richard Ewell. We'll talk some about him. And then the Third Corps is Lieutenant General A.P. Hill. And each of these had roughly 20,000. Hill's Corps was a little bit bigger. There's also a cavalry division commanded by Major General J.E.B. or Jeb Stuart. And we'll talk quite a bit about Stuart and what he did during this battle. So that's the basic. We just want to make sure that everybody knows what we talk about, what we mean when we say the corps, or this division, or this regiment. And obviously the book and therefore the movie, they do not attempt to give a complete history of the battle. They don't talk about every corps, every division. They focus on certain key ones. Like on the northern side, they focus on the corps led by General Winfield Scott Hancock, and they also focus on the 20th Maine Regiment led by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, or just Lawrence as he's called. And then on the other side, on the southern side, they focus primarily on Longstreet's corps, and then he has a famous division in there commanded by General George Pickett. And then within Pickett's division, there are 3 brigades, and those are pretty major characters too, the commanders of those, General Armstead, General Kemper, and General Garnett. So just that's an overview. You may want to jot some of that down or go back and listen to this again. I didn't want to go into too much detail, but I felt like it was necessary to talk at least a little bit about it. And can I talk about just the very, very beginning too for a minute, Steve?
Well, can I jump in?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Add? There's a couple of things to note about the armies. First of all, there is one more unit that you missed. And that is the artillery was a little bit different. Instead of having regiments,
yes,
they had batteries, and these were 5 to 10 guns, cannon, and then they were organized into brigades. So that's the one thing to note about. And generally, they were attached to a corps, but not necessarily to a division. So when you had they were independent to the different divisions that were out there. They supported the whole battlefield. Now, some units at different times may have had attached artillery, but for the most part, the Union and the Confederacy both had artillery brigades underneath the corps level. The other thing to note is that you talked about the different commanding types and being on paper versus actual. And remember, up to really this week of the war, both armies were volunteer armies, and they were organized by state. So there would be the 7th Indiana, or the 1st Texas, or the 12th Massachusetts. These were regiments that were organized by state, and they were generally either the state militia or they were volunteers from that state. And they were kept together by state. And that becomes an important part of the story in a few moments. Yeah. We'll see. But the units were commanded by men from that state in terms of regiments. Now, you may have multiple state regiments underneath a single brigade. And generally speaking, we talked about that. Generally speaking, you had a colonel commanding a regiment. You had a brigadier general commanding a brigade. However, because this was wartime and there was constant casualties due to battle, you didn't always have that. Sometimes you had a colonel commanding a brigade because someone got promoted. A brigadier general got promoted to the division because the major general got promoted to the corps, or was killed, or was sick, or was gone. And so you, at different times, you may have a colonel commanding a brigade, and a brigadier general commanding a division, and a major commanding a regiment. Now, as casualties occurred, you may actually find yourself with a captain commanding a regiment, especially in a battle like this, where there was tens of thousands of men killed. So that's something to remember. And the reason why these units were we talk about on paper is because they were part of the state's military, volunteer military. They had to be refilled from within the state. So you didn't have Pennsylvania men in a New York unit. You had to go and recruit men from New York to refill the regiment. And that was an important thing. Now, as we get into I just said this week in history, for at the same time as the battle, the draft was about to occur in the North. And so then you would have units. I don't think they had polyglot units, but you wouldn't have to go recruit men. Each state would supply men to refill the ranks of a unit. Now that was interesting because at the time, these men had been together since the unit had formed. For the most part, the corps of these different regiments, some of them had been fighting since 1861. And so they were whittled down to they may have started with 500 men or 300 men or whatever, but they were down to 100 men, that were original men. So that's something to remember. And then the South, with much smaller base of population, they had regiments that maybe were not even a full company, that were just regiments in name and not necessarily in size.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. So this battle took place in late June, early July of 1863. What's the really short story of how these two armies met up in southern Pennsylvania? Gettysburg is just slightly to the east of central Pennsylvania, on pretty close to the border with Maryland, just to get that picture in your brain. But you can bring up a map to see that it's a pretty important location where a lot of roads, especially at that time, but even today, a lot of roads come together. Like I was saying, what got these two armies in Pennsylvania at that time when the war had been going on for about 2 years and some change at this point?
Well, let me try to sum up 2 years of history very quickly here. But essentially, the main Confederate Army, which eventually becomes known as the Army of Northern Virginia, and the Union Army, which was not at first, but soon after the war starts, is called the Army of the Potomac. Those two armies had been slugging it out in and around Virginia since July of 1861. And without going into all the battles in detail and all the commanders, let me just say that almost every time the Union attacked a Confederate army, or the Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, the Union lost. They lost the Battle of First Bull Run or First Manassas. They lost the Peninsula Campaign, which was composed of several individual brief battles. They lost at Second Bull Run or Second Manassas. The Union lost at Fredericksburg. And before Fredericksburg, there was Antietam, which was kind of a tie. Lee had taken the army into Maryland to try to get some fresh supplies and to find some more food because Virginia was just about eaten up. That was technically a draw, although the Confederates retreated back into Virginia, so the North claimed that one as a victory. Then you had Fredericksburg, which was a Union disaster, and then you had Chancellorsville, which was another Union disaster. And so that brings us up to May of 1863. Not long after that, by the way, Stonewall Jackson, who was probably the most famous Confederate Corps commander up to that point, and probably the most effective one, at least in some ways, he was killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Originally, Lee's army had two corps, the first corps led by Longstreet and the second corps led by General Stonewall Jackson. But once Jackson is killed, Lee splits it into the second corps into two corps and gives one part to A.P. Hill, and he gives the other corps to Richard Ewell. And that's going to be Ewell and Hill never were really able to live up to Jackson's performance level or his potential. They had potential, but they didn't live up to the potential. So that's going to be one of the things that we're going to be discussing throughout the discussion. But so Lee decides in June of 1863 to take his army north again. He's going to invade the north for a second time. This time he wants to go further than Maryland. He wants to go into Pennsylvania. So Lee marches his army north. They cross the Potomac. They cross through a skinny little part of Maryland, and then they end up in Pennsylvania. Lee, they're again searching for supplies, but they also want to send a message to the north that, hey, we can come around, we can invade your territory, and they're threatening all kinds of areas. Who knows where they're going to go? The movie says, at the beginning of the movie, it says that Lee is carrying a letter that's supposed to be placed on Abraham Lincoln's desk after the Confederates take over Washington, giving him terms of peace. But anyway, Lee spreads out the army a little bit. He sends Ewell's corps a little bit to the north around York. He sends Longstreet further west, and then Hill's corps west, but not as far as Longstreet's. And he spreads them out because if they're all in one place, they're going to eat up all the food and kill all the cows and take all the milk and all the fruit and everything. They're going to eat it up too fast, so they have to put them in different areas so that they all have plenty of food and other supplies. Another thing Lee does, which is a fatal decision, or maybe, I shouldn't say fatal, but fateful, it's very important, is he sends his head of cavalry, Jeb Stuart, off on a mission to gather intelligence about what the Union Army is doing and to bring it back to Lee. But Stuart is not going to do that, or at least he's going to take too long. He's going to be late. So Lee is going to be basically flying blind. Lee, the purpose of cavalry in the Civil War primarily was to gather intelligence, to figure out where your enemy was and how strong they were, where they were moving to, what they were doing, who's in command, and all that. And Stuart is not going to get that information to Lee on a timely basis. One of the things, as Lee is heading north, General Hooker, who is the commander of the Union Army, he heads north to follow him. But Hooker gets into an argument with President Lincoln, and he offers his resignation, and Lincoln gladly accepts it. So Lincoln appoints as the new commander of the Army of the Potomac, and this is about the fifth one they've had. He appoints General George Gordon Meade on June, I think it was the 28th or 29th. So not long before the battle is going to happen. So General Meade marches the army up into Pennsylvania to try to make sure that the Southern Army cannot get anywhere near Washington, and maybe hopefully to capture it and defeat it. And so that is how both armies end up in Pennsylvania. When Robert E. Lee learns that the Union Army is coming his way, he orders his three corps to concentrate, and they're going to concentrate near the town of Gettysburg, which was a crossroads town. There were many roads in and out of it going all different directions. Sean, you want to add to that?
No, and those who don't know about the history of the time is that cavalry was the most important unit for an army on the move seeking to have a battle anywhere, because that cavalry would, especially in unfamiliar territory, the cavalry would scout, and they would see where the enemy was. They would find the ground where the ideal passes through hills and mountains and forests, and they'd find about where the roads were and what the visibility was from different positions on a potential battlefield. And Stuart had a history of daring, dashing maneuvers around the enemy, but had been in areas where he had known the ground. He'd known the territory, like in, Eastern Virginia. And he was also very vain and vainglorious, and he was quite interested in getting his name in the papers. And so that's the thing, is he went way, way east of the army. He actually went to Washington, D.C. and did a quote unquote raid on the city. And quite frankly, I want to take an aside here just very quickly. The idea that they would put a letter on Lincoln's desk after taking the city of Washington with 80,000 men was ludicrous, because Washington, D.C. at the time was probably the most fortified city in the world. Washington, D.C. is across the river from Virginia. So they were quite well able to defend themselves. I don't think they would have stormed the city and taken the White House by force.
Give the Confederates points for optimism.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, that's the stage that's set. And so I think that gets us in a good spot. Steve, I don't mean to, or do you want to move us over, or do you want me to segue?
Go ahead.
Okay. I think that puts us in a good spot to get into the movie itself. So this is really where the movie starts. And the movie starts on a gentleman named Harrison, and he is an actor. He is a historical character, a historical person. He was an actor who was basically a spy. He was in the service of the Confederacy, in the service of General Longstreet, and he was roaming around northern Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania ahead of the army, dressed in civilian clothes and pretending to be someone who was looking for his wife. That's what you find in the book. But he was taking notes on where the Union was, and so he's riding around this beautiful, beautiful country in Maryland and Pennsylvania, and he sees the Union Army coming, and so he goes back to Longstreet and tells him that he's seen all these units coming in. They're from First Corps. He's seen the Black Hats, who are one of the units, the Iron Brigade, one of the famous northern units, military units, because they wore black hats. So he's able to tell them that the Union Army is moving north, and they're headed towards them. And so this gives them a warning that there's a potential for a battle. And so Longstreet goes to Lee, tells him what Harrison's told him. And Lee is quite skeptical of the actor, but because he says that Stuart would have told him. And this, I think, becomes a recurring theme, is that Lee's character just can't believe that Stuart, his trusted cavalry commander, is not telling him where the Union is moving. So then you cut to the 20th Maine. This is a Union regiment, and an Irish sergeant named Buster Kilrain tells Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain that they have a new commander, General Meade, and that they have 120 mutineers who are being sent to them from another unit, the 2nd Maine, and they're going to be delivered to them because they had mutinied. They were not going to fight. And so Lawrence has to deal with them. And, of course, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is Jeff Daniels. Then we switch back to Lee's camp, and they've been talking. They're going to move, and they're going to start to wheel towards in the direction of Washington, D.C., and they're going to go to this crossroads town of Gettysburg. And that's where they decide they're going to head. But Lee gives orders to the different units. They're not to engage. They're not to fight. They should not get involved in a battle. Mm-hmm. And so we're back and forth between Lee and Chamberlain's group. The 20th Maine has had a lot of casualties, and so they've got this new group of 120 men. And the reason they have problems and they didn't want to fight is because they had most of the 2nd Maine had signed 1-year enlistments, and these 120 men didn't realize that they'd signed 2-year enlistments, and they didn't want to fight without the rest of their unit. So the rest of their unit went home, and they still had another year left on their enlistments. And so they decide they're not going to fight. And Chamberlain, he's a decent person. He's a teacher. He's a college professor and not quite a minister, but a professor of theology. So he's got a deep moral center. And he gives a speech to them about how they're all Maine men, and he's not going to shoot them. He's not going to hang them. He says that we've been fighting just like you have, and we've got a battle coming, we need your help. So it's very inspiring. A very lofty speech. Who knows if he actually gave it? It's a very inspiring speech.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Yeah, I read that it's just probably made up by Michael Shara.
I'm sure it is.
He did give a brief motivational speech from what I read, but it was nothing this long or this lofty.
Steve, why don't you throw your line out about speeches with destiny?
I mean, that is the whole book and the movie is speeches with destiny, where the characters don't really talk to each other. They talk with the future audience. That Scott Rank used that a lot with when we were talking about John Wayne, how John Wayne never talks to people. He talks with destiny. Mm-hmm. And that's what every single character that was one critique I had of the book, is there weren't a lot of authentic conversations between people and characters, which I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of. And I think maybe there is some truth to that these were not generally people who bared all their emotions to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Most of them are pretty reticent.
Yeah, in the book, there's a lot of internal monologuing too.
It's stream of consciousness, and they can't do that in the movie. They do a little bit of it, but a lot in the book, somebody's thinking to themselves. In the movie, it turns into a speech. A
lot of this also came out of memoirs that these people wrote, and they wrote them years later, and for a different time. They wrote them in the late 1880s, 1890s. Late 1800s, right? And it's not the same. When you read these memoirs, they're very lofty because that was the way memoirs were written. I did this, and my thought was that General Lee was that. Right. You know, it's that's where I think Shara got a lot of his information, and there's a lot of interesting things probably that he made up, but also things that really occurred. The other place I think you get a lot of stuff from, and you see this in the movie, in the Civil War documentary, is letters. And letters were very flowery. You know, my darling wife, my heart is inspired with love for you. You know, things like, I don't know how these people managed to write these things because I couldn't think of them, but you know, so I think that's where a lot of his dialogue extrapolated came from. And so you hit the nail on the head, Stephen. It's speeches with destiny. They're not talking to the people they're talking to. Well, the next scene is a good one, and this is where we get Sam Elliott. And I think this is the point where we need to talk about facial hair in this film.
At least
Elliott,
he had a real mustache.
Right. Sam Elliott is famed for the national treasure that is his mustache.
I think it needs to get its own star on the Walk of Fame or whatever it is. Yeah.
It does. It absolutely does. And Sam Elliott is too old for the part, but he plays a brigadier general in the Union cavalry named John Buford, who was only 32 or 33 when the battle occurred, which is freaky. But anyway, the other characters, I'm pretty sure most everybody else has definitely fake beards and mustaches. I think Martin Sheen, is literally wearing a carpet on his face. and Tom Berenger's beard, it looks better, but it's massive. If it was white, he'd look like Santa Claus.
His beard develops as a character throughout the movie as well. It
does. At one point, it sticks straight out ahead. It's ridiculous. And when he's talking to Armstead on the last day, it's just amazing. Yeah,
there's a few people with some real beards, and it seems like some real mustaches, but most of them, especially the full beard ones, is crazy big beards. But you go back and look at those pictures. Go look at Jeb Stuart's beard. His beard was pretty wild. So I don't know. At any rate, John Buford's cavalry is scouting, doing their job for the Union Army. They're riding ahead and scouting the Confederates, and they know that the Confederates are headed towards Gettysburg. And they get to the town, and this is while the other Union units are marching in, headed towards that direction. And Buford has a great scene where they find this ground south that's east of the town. He kind of scouts the ground and talks about the different areas of ground. And the ground is like the battlefield. That's a big part of this section of the movie and of the film. He really lays out, this is why this part of the area is important, because south of Gettysburg, of the town of Gettysburg, there is a line of hills and ridges. And if the Confederates occupy it, Meade's going to have to attack. And they're going to come in and they're going to get killed. It's going to be impregnable to throw the Confederates off of this position. And so he has to protect this ground. And west of town, there's another ridge called Seminary Ridge. So the ridge the ridge in the hill line that's south of town is called Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge, and it runs down to two rocky hills where there's a pass between them. West of town, there's a Lutheran seminary, and there's a ridge that seminary sits on, and it's a good position right astride a road and a railroad track where the Confederates are coming from, and he knows he can defend that, and so he sets up his division, which is a cavalry division, much smaller than an infantry division, and they set up to defend this ridge. And he sends off to the rest of the Union Army and says, "You got to get here. We're going to hold this ground as long as we can." So that gives us the day before the battle. That's June 30th.
So what? How would you how would you evaluate that first day then?
The day -1?
Yeah, the 30th, where they're all just coming together.
Well, from a film perspective, it's sort of a setting the stage for this, the main part of the film. From a history perspective, it's sort of I think that it's sort of a comedy of errors, because Lee didn't give Longstreet permission to actually go into the town. I think they ended up going into the town. One of the units goes in because they need shoes and food, I think, is what happened in history. But it's not intended to have this big battle at this crossroads town. It's just Buford takes a stand where he knows that the Confederates are going to be coming in, and he takes a stand, and he knows that this ground that they're on, this is the place where if the Confederates do get it, they're not ever going to be able to dislodge them. Now the thing is that the Confederates don't know really up until the point when Harrison tells them where the full army is, and they only know one corps. They don't know is where the rest of the corps is coming from. Is the rest of the corps coming up from the northeast? Is they coming up from due east? Are they following behind them? And what they really want to do is they want to get between the Union Army and Washington, D.C., because then the Union Army has to attack them. But the idea of the time is make your enemy attack you, make your enemy fight you on the ground of your choosing. That was Napoleon's way of fighting. That was Frederick the Great's way of fighting. And that was how they had all been trained at West Point to fight battles, is make your enemy, find the best ground, the best position, and you make your enemy attack you, or you attack your enemy in a place where he doesn't want to be attacked. So that was the way you fought battles. Yeah,
piggybacking on what Sean said, as he mentioned, there was this terrific high ground south and southeast of the town, and what Buford is trying to accomplish is just to hold off the Confederates as long as possible until the full Union Army can get up. They're south of the town. They're still marching up as quickly as they can. And there's a great scene where Buford turns to one of his subordinates, a man named Colonel Devon, and he says, "Devon, I've led a soldier's life. I've never seen anything as brutally clear as this. It's as if I can actually see the blue troops in one long bloody moment going up the long slope to the stony top, as if they're already done and already a memory. Odds set stony quality to it, as if tomorrow's already happened and there's nothing you can do about it. The way you sometimes feel before an ill-considered attack, knowing it'll fail, but you cannot stop it. You must even take part and help it fail." And he talks about how men in Washington will thump their chests and say, what a brave charge it was. And so Buford has seen this kind of thing happen time after time to the Union Army, and he's determined he's not going to let it happen.
Yeah, I don't think he actually had that speech in real life, but it plays well.
No, it's in the book. One thing we should mention, I don't think we've actually said this yet, is that the movie is a super faithful adaptation of the book. I mean, a lot of the dialogue is word for word from the book, and
scene for scene, really, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and if it's not word for word, it's really close. They only made a few minor changes in the scenes. I don't think I've ever seen a movie that was so faithful to the book as this one. Have you guys?
No, like you were saying, Sean, so much of the book was internal monologue that they couldn't really do. But so if you took I listened to the audiobook, which was about 10 hours long, and the movie was about 4.5 hours long. There really was about 6 hours of internal monologue.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it is very faithful. There's a few movies that are pretty faithful, but this movie moves and flows in a good way that Gods and Generals did not. So Gods and Generals is just a little boring at times.
Well, so I think that's a good wrap up of the prelude to the battle. Next up, we'll get into the very first day of the battle, which was on Wednesday, July 1st, 1863.